The Pacific, 1942. Below the deck of a burning carrier, men fought an enemy that needed no orders and took no prisoners. Fire. It moved faster than they could run, hotter than steel could endure, and deadlier than any torpedo. For every ship lost to Japanese bombs, another was claimed by the flames that followed. The Navy's firefighting methods, heavy hoses, seawater streams, brute force, were failing. Ships were dying not from the first hit, but from what came after. Then came a shift so subtle it seemed impossible. Instead of fighting fire with force, engineers proposed fighting it with air, a fine mist, lighter than fog, cooler than rain, dispersed through physics rather than pressure. It sounded like theory. It looked like desperation. But in the chaos of burning compartments and smoke-filled passageways, this quiet innovation would rewrite survival itself. This is the story of the men who refused to accept that burning ships were a fact of war, and the simple science that turned vapor into salvation. Before we continue, subscribe and turn on the bell. Here we tell real, untold stories of World War II, stories of innovation, desperation, and the fragile moments when human ingenuity turned the tide of survival. February 1942. Somewhere in the South Pacific, beneath the flight deck of a carrier still smoldering from the previous day's attack, a damage control officer stood in water up to his knees. The compartment reeked of burning oil and scorched metal. Around him, sailors wrestled with canvas hoses thick as a man's arm, dragging them through narrow hatches, fighting the weight, the pressure, the physics of trying to aim a river at a fire that moved like a living thing. The hoses were standard issue, designed for harbor fires, pier blazes, controlled situations where men had room to maneuver and time to think. Down here, in the belly of a warship under attack, they were monuments to futility. Each hose required 4 men to control. The water pressure knocked sailors off their feet. The streams were powerful, yes, but they were also indiscriminate, flooding compartments, shorting electrical systems, adding tons of weight to a ship already listing from battle damage, and the fires kept burning. Above deck, the damage was visible: twisted metal, shattered glass, the black smudge of explosions frozen against gray paint. But below, in the engineering spaces and ammunition storage rooms, the real war was being fought in increments. A fire that started in one compartment could spread through ventilation ducts, along electrical conduits, into spaces no hose could reach. By the time sailors dragged their equipment into position, the flames had already moved. The officer watched his men struggle. They were good sailors, trained, disciplined, following every procedure the Navy had taught them, but the procedures were failing. The water they poured into burning spaces did extinguish some flames, yes, but it also created new problems. Steam scalded anyone too close. Flooded compartments compromised stability. And worst of all, the heavy streams often failed to reach the base of oil fires where fuel floated on the surface of the flooding water, burning even as the compartment filled. In another section of the ship, an engineering officer was making notes. He had watched 3 major fires in as many months. He had seen men die not from enemy action but from their own firefighting efforts, trapped in flooded compartments, scalded by steam, overcome by smoke while wrestling equipment that was never designed for these conditions. The hoses themselves had become casualties of war. The problem was fundamental. Water, delivered in heavy streams, was a blunt instrument. It cooled fire through mass, overwhelming heat with volume. But in the confined spaces of a warship, volume was the enemy. Every gallon added weight. Every stream created chaos. And the fires, fed by aviation fuel and hydraulic fluid, burned too hot and too fast for traditional methods to contain them. That night, after the fires were finally controlled and the dead were counted, the engineering officer sat in his quarters and sketched. He was thinking about surface area, about evaporation, about the basic physics he had learned years ago in a classroom that now seemed impossibly distant. Water extinguished fire by absorbing heat. But what if, instead of delivering water in heavy streams, they could deliver it in a form that maximized its cooling potential? What if they stopped trying to drown the fire and started trying to cool it? The idea was simple in theory: break water into the finest possible droplets, create a mist so fine it would hang in the air like fog. Each tiny droplet would have enormous surface area relative to its mass. The mist would absorb heat not through volume but through vaporization, turning from liquid to gas, stealing thermal energy from the flames in the process. It would cool the air itself, making it harder for fire to sustain combustion. And it would do all this while using a fraction of the water traditional hoses consumed. He looked at his sketches. They seemed absurd. Fighting fire with fog, replacing power with delicacy, trusting physics over force. But the alternative was continuing to watch ships burn, and continuing to send men into compartments armed with equipment that was killing them almost as efficiently as the enemy. The next morning, he submitted his proposal through official channels. It disappeared into the bureaucracy of wartime Navy administration, one more idea among thousands, filed away while the war continued and the ships kept burning. But in a laboratory thousands of miles away, another engineer was having the same thought. Spring 1942. In a naval research facility far from the sound of guns, an engineer named Patterson stood before a metal chamber about the size of a cargo container. Inside, controlled fires burned at temperatures that simulated combat conditions. Around him, instruments measured heat, oxygen levels, water consumption, and cooling efficiency. This was where theory met flame, where ideas were tested not with calculations but with fire itself. Patterson had spent months studying firefighting failures. He had read reports from damaged ships, interviewed survivors, analyzed photographs of burned compartments. The pattern was undeniable. Traditional firefighting methods, heavy streams from pressurized hoses, were failing not because sailors lacked courage or training, but because the physics were wrong. The Navy was fighting 20th century fires with 19th century methods. The breakthrough had come from an unexpected source. Patterson had been reviewing industrial firefighting techniques, methods used in oil refineries and chemical plants where conventional water streams were not just ineffective, but dangerous. In those facilities, engineers had developed spray systems that atomized water into fine droplets, creating a cooling mist that suppressed fires without adding dangerous weight or creating explosive steam. Could the same principle work aboard a warship? The theory was elegant. Water droplets measuring less than 400 microns, finer than mist, approaching the boundary of fog, would remain suspended in air long enough to absorb massive amounts of heat through evaporation. A single gallon of water, properly atomized, could cool an area that would require 50 gallons delivered through a traditional hose. The mist would penetrate spaces that streams could not reach, flowing through ventilation systems, around corners, into the hidden voids where fires smoldered and waited. But theory and practice, Patterson knew, were separated by the cruel filter of reality. The first tests were discouraging. The spray nozzles clogged with salt deposits from seawater. The mist dissipated too quickly in open spaces. The pressure systems required to atomize water properly consumed too much power. And most damning of all, when Patterson ignited a test fire using actual aviation fuel, the kind that burned on carrier decks, the mist seemed to do nothing at all. The flames roared unchanged, indifferent to the delicate fog drifting through the chamber. Patterson adjusted. He changed nozzle designs, modified spray patterns, altered droplet sizes. He learned that mist alone was not enough. It needed to be combined with proper ventilation control, with foam suppressants for oil fires, with training that taught sailors to understand what they were seeing. The mist did not extinguish flames the way water streams did. It did not knock fire down with visible force. Instead, it worked invisibly, cooling the air, starving combustion of the heat it needed to sustain itself. It was firefighting through suffocation rather than drowning. By summer, Patterson had refined the system to the point where he could demonstrate measurable results. In controlled tests, mist systems reduced compartment temperatures by hundreds of degrees within minutes. They used 90% less water than traditional hoses. They could be operated by a single sailor rather than a four-man team. And crucially, they did not flood compartments or compromise ship stability. But Patterson also understood something the initial proponents had missed. The mist system was not a replacement for hoses. It was a complement. Different fires required different approaches. An oil fire on a hangar deck needed foam and mist. An electrical fire needed mist and isolation. A magazine fire needed flooding, period. The innovation was not in replacing old methods but in giving sailors options, tools that matched the physics of what they were fighting. He prepared his report with clinical precision. Charts showing temperature reduction rates, graphs comparing water consumption, photographs of test chambers before and after mist deployment. He documented everything because he knew that in wartime, innovation faced an enemy more formidable than any fire: institutional inertia. The Navy had procedures, manuals, training regimens built over decades. Changing those systems required not just proof but overwhelming proof. It required demonstration so undeniable that even the most conservative officer would have to acknowledge that men were dying because the service was clinging to methods that no longer worked. Patterson's report reached Washington in July. It was reviewed by engineering boards, damage control specialists, and fleet commanders. Some were intrigued, others were skeptical, and many simply filed it away. Another theoretical innovation that might work in laboratories but would fail in the chaos of actual combat. Then, in August, a carrier returning from the Pacific delivered a report that changed everything. During an attack, a fire had broken out in a machinery space. The damage control team, following standard procedures, had advanced with their hoses, but the compartment was too confined, the fire too hot, and the smoke too thick. 2 sailors died trying to wrestle their equipment into position. The fire burned for 4 hours before finally being contained. In his post-action report, the ship's chief engineer added a single paragraph. He had read about the MIST system in a technical journal. He wondered, in careful language, whether such a system might have saved his men. The paragraph was circulated, discussed, debated, and finally, grudgingly, approved for field testing. October 1942. The destroyer pulled into port with new equipment installed in her damage control stations. To the casual observer, the changes were barely visible. A few new pipes running along bulkheads, modified nozzles in compartment ceilings, additional pressure gauges in engineering spaces. But to the sailors who would stake their lives on this equipment, the system represented either salvation or dangerous experimentation. The crew called it the fog machine. They were not impressed. Chief Warrant Officer Morrison, who had been fighting fires at sea since before most of his sailors were born, stood in the main damage control station and stared at the new installation with undisguised skepticism. He had survived 3 ship fires using hoses and hard work. He trusted water pressure and canvas and the strength of men working together. This new system, with its delicate nozzles and complicated pressure requirements, looked like something that would fail exactly when it was needed most. But Morrison was also a professional. Orders were orders. If the Navy wanted him to test fog against fire, he would test fog against fire. He just hoped he would not have to write letters to widows explaining that their husbands had died because someone in Washington thought innovation was more important than proven methods. The training began immediately. Engineers from the research facility came aboard to explain the system. They spoke in the language of physics, heat transfer coefficients, droplet size distributions, evaporative cooling rates. The sailors listened with the polite attention of men being told how to do a job they already knew how to do. Then came the demonstrations. The engineers set up controlled burns in a sealed compartment. First, they attacked a fire using traditional hoses. The sailors watched as 4 men wrestled with canvas as water flooded the deck, as steam billowed and heat pushed everyone back. The fire was extinguished, yes, but the compartment was destroyed, flooded, scorched. Its electrical systems shorted out. Then they burned the same materials again. This time they activated the MIST system. Fine spray filled the air like morning fog rolling off water. For 30 seconds, nothing seemed to happen. The fire still burned. The sailors exchanged glances that said what they were thinking. Useless. But then the flames began to shrink. Not knocked down, not drowned, but somehow diminished. The air itself seemed to cool. The roar of combustion faded to a hiss, then to silence. When the mist cleared, the fire was gone. The compartment was damp but not flooded. The electrical systems still functioned, and not a single sailor had been scalded by steam or knocked over by water pressure. Morrison said nothing, but something in his expression shifted. The real test came 3 weeks later. The destroyer was conducting night operations when a fuel line ruptured in the engine room. Aviation gas, the most dangerous substance aboard any warship, sprayed across hot machinery and ignited instantly. The fire spread with terrifying speed, racing along pipes and pooling in low spaces. In the narrow confines of the engine room, traditional firefighting would have been suicide. The damage control team responded within seconds, but this time, instead of dragging hoses, they activated the MIST system and sealed the compartment. Through the observation port, they watched fog fill the space like something alive. The fire, which moments before had been consuming everything it touched, began to retreat. The fuel-fed flames could not sustain themselves in air being continuously cooled by evaporating water droplets. Within 6 minutes, the fire was controlled. Within 10, it was extinguished. No one had entered the compartment. No one had been injured. The engine room, despite the severity of the fire, remained operational after basic repairs. Morrison stood outside the sealed hatch and realized he had just witnessed something that would have been impossible a year ago. Men would have died fighting this fire using traditional methods. The ship itself might have been lost, but instead, physics had done the work that courage and canvas could not. Now tell us in the comments where you're watching from and how far these forgotten wartime stories have reached. Your voice helps keep memory alive. That night, Morrison wrote his report with unusual care. He described the fire, the response, the results. Then he added something he rarely included in official documents: a recommendation. The MIST system, he wrote, should be installed on every ship in the fleet, not as an experiment, not as an option, but as standard equipment, as essential as pumps and hatches and the hulls themselves. His report joined Patterson's research, joined the carrier engineer's post-action analysis, joined a growing body of evidence that was becoming impossible to ignore. The fog machine, it turned out, was not a replacement for firefighters. It was a way to keep firefighters alive long enough to do their jobs. December 1942. In a conference room in Washington, far from burning ships and desperate sailors, senior officers debated the future of naval firefighting. On one side sat advocates for the MIST system, armed with test results and survivor testimonies. On the other sat traditionalists, men who had spent careers mastering conventional damage control and who viewed innovation with the suspicion it often deserved. The resistance was not rooted in stupidity or stubbornness. It came from hard experience. The Navy had seen miracle solutions before, technologies that worked perfectly in laboratories but failed catastrophically in combat. Every new system came with promises. Most came with problems that only revealed themselves when men's lives depended on performance. Commander Halstead, who had survived the sinking of his cruiser 6 months earlier, spoke with the authority of someone who had watched shipmates die. His concern was simple: reliability. The MIST system depended on functioning pumps, unclogged nozzles, properly maintained pressure regulators. In combat, when ships were damaged and systems were failing, could sailors trust equipment that seemed so delicate? Fire doesn't wait for repairs, Halstead said, his voice carrying the weight of memory. When a man grabs a hose, he knows it will work. It might not be elegant, but it's proven. How do we know this MIST system won't fail exactly when we need it most? Patterson, present to defend his innovation, did not argue. He acknowledged the concern because it was legitimate. Instead, he presented data from the destroyer trials. The MIST system had been tested under combat conditions, during attacks, with damage to the ship, with partially functioning equipment. In every case, even when components failed, the system had provided some firefighting capability. And unlike hoses, which required multiple sailors to operate, the MIST could be activated by anyone, even wounded men working alone. But Halstead pressed his point: training. Every sailor in the fleet knew how to fight fire with water and hoses. Introducing a new system meant retraining thousands of men in the middle of a war. It meant revising manuals, updating procedures, teaching physics to sailors who needed immediate practical knowledge. Was there time for that when ships were burning right now? The debate continued through the afternoon. Engineering officers presented efficiency calculations. Medical officers discussed burn injuries prevented. Supply officers worried about installation costs and equipment availability. Each perspective was valid. Each concern was real. Then, an intelligence officer distributed a new report. The Japanese had begun using kamikaze tactics. Pilots were deliberately crashing their aircraft into American ships, turning planes into guided bombs. The impact damage was catastrophic, yes, but the fires that followed were worse. Aviation fuel from the crashed planes ignited everything it touched. Ships that survived the initial crash were being consumed by flames that spread faster than damage control teams could respond. Traditional firefighting methods were proving inadequate against this new threat. Hoses could not be positioned quickly enough. Water flooding created instability in already damaged vessels. And the intense heat from aviation fuel fires was killing sailors before they could even approach with their equipment. The MIST system, the intelligence officer noted, had been specifically designed to handle aviation fuel fires. It could be activated remotely. It worked in spaces too hot for human entry, and it used minimal water, preserving ship stability. The room fell silent. Commander Halstead looked at the report for a long moment. Then he asked Patterson a single question: how fast can you install this system across the fleet? Patterson had prepared for resistance. He had anticipated skepticism. What he had not fully prepared for was acceptance. Not because the Navy embraced innovation, but because the war had forced a choice between theoretical risks and certain death. The decision was made that afternoon. The MIST system would be standardized across all combat vessels. Priority installation would focus on carriers and destroyers, the ships most vulnerable to fire. Training would begin immediately, compressed into intensive courses that taught sailors not the physics behind the system, but the practical reality of how to use it. But even as the orders were drafted, everyone in that room understood a harder truth. The system would not be ready in time to save every ship. Men would still die fighting fires with inadequate equipment. Ships would still burn because installation schedules could not keep pace with combat deployment. The innovation that would eventually save hundreds of vessels would come too late for dozens more. That was the mathematics of wartime technological change. Every advance was measured not just in lives saved, but in lives that would have been saved if the innovation had come sooner. Patterson left Washington that evening with authorization to proceed and a profound sense of inadequacy. He had created something that worked, but working in the abstract was different from working in time to matter. The gap between invention and implementation was measured in months. The gap between a ship catching fire and a ship sinking was measured in minutes. Somewhere in the Pacific, another vessel was burning. Sailors were fighting flames with hoses and courage. Some would survive, some would not. And the equipment that might have saved them sat in warehouses, waiting for installation schedules and training programs, and all the bureaucratic machinery that stood between innovation and application. The system worked, but war did not wait for systems to be ready. January 1943. The carrier limped into Pearl Harbor with her flight deck scorched black, and her superstructure twisted from heat. She had taken a bomb through the hangar deck during an attack 3 days earlier. The impact had killed 17 men instantly. The fire that followed had threatened to destroy the ship entirely. The damage control team had fought that fire for 6 hours using every method available. They had flooded compartments, deployed chemical foam, sealed bulkheads, and finally, desperately, activated the newly installed MIST system in spaces too hot for men to enter. The MIST had not extinguished the fire by itself, but it had cooled the surrounding areas enough that sailors could advance with hoses to finish the job. The ship survived, but 32 men did not. In the investigation that followed, investigators tried to determine what had worked and what had failed. They interviewed survivors, studied damage patterns, analyzed response times. What they discovered was more complex than anyone had anticipated. The MIST system had performed as designed. In compartments where it had been properly installed and activated, it had dramatically reduced fire spread and cooling time. But the system had only been installed in primary damage control spaces. The fire had started in a maintenance area that still relied on traditional equipment. By the time the flames reached spaces protected by MIST, the fire was already out of control. The lesson was obvious but painful. Partial implementation was almost as dangerous as no implementation at all. Fire did not respect installation schedules. A ship was only as protected as its weakest compartment. The Navy responded with revised priorities. Installation crews began working around the clock, retrofitting vessels between combat deployments. But the mathematics were unforgiving. The fleet numbered in the hundreds. Each installation required days of work, and ships could not be pulled from combat operations for extended refits, not when the Pacific War was intensifying and every vessel was desperately needed. So they compromised. Essential spaces first: engine rooms, magazines, aviation fuel storage, combat information centers. Secondary spaces would be upgraded as time and resources allowed. It was a rational decision based on limited resources and unlimited danger. It was also a decision that meant some fires would be fought with 19th century methods while the solution sat unused in adjacent compartments. Aboard the damaged carrier, Chief Morrison supervised repairs and thought about the men who had died. 3 of them had been in his damage control team. He knew their families, had written letters home, had trained them himself. They had died doing everything right, following procedures, showing courage, using their equipment as effectively as anyone could have. But effectiveness had not been enough. The hoses they carried were too slow. The water they deployed was insufficient. And the compartment they entered, not yet equipped with MIST systems, had become their tomb. Morrison did not blame the Navy. He did not blame the engineers or the bureaucracy or the inevitable friction between innovation and implementation. He blamed the war itself for demanding perfection from men and equipment that could only ever be approximately adequate. That night, he gathered his remaining team and explained how they would adapt. New procedures, new equipment, new tactics that combined traditional methods with the MIST system. They would train until every man could operate both systems reflexively. They would drill until response time was measured in seconds, not minutes. They would prepare not for the fires they expected but for the ones they feared. Because in war, preparation was the only defense against chaos. Across the Pacific, other ships were conducting similar training. Sailors who had initially mocked the fog machine were now treating it with the respect afforded to equipment that saved lives. The skepticism had not vanished. It had transformed into something more useful: careful attention to maintenance, proper testing of systems, understanding of both capabilities and limitations. The MIST system was not magic. It was physics applied to survival. And physics, sailors were learning, required precision. A clogged nozzle was useless. A malfunctioning pressure regulator was dangerous. The system demanded attention and care in ways that simple hoses did not. But when it worked, when everything functioned as designed, the results were undeniable. Fires that would have destroyed compartments were contained. Spaces that would have been flooded remained operational. And most importantly, sailors survived encounters with flames that would have killed them months earlier. By March 1943, enough ships had been equipped and enough fires had been fought that patterns emerged. The Navy compiled data, analyzed results, refined procedures. They learned which nozzle placements were most effective, which pressure settings worked best for different types of fires, how to integrate MIST systems with traditional firefighting without creating dangerous conflicts. The system was evolving from experimental technology to standard practice, but evolution required time, and time was measured in ships that burned, sailors who died, and lessons purchased with blood and loss. If this story has moved you, leave a like. It helps others discover how humanity can survive even inside the walls of captivity. Commander Halstead, reviewing reports in Washington, saw both progress and inadequacy. The MIST system was working, but working felt insufficient when each casualty report included names of men who might have survived with better equipment installed sooner. There was no satisfaction in being right about innovation, when being right came too late to matter for everyone. April 1943. Aboard a destroyer escort conducting anti-submarine operations, Seaman First Class Rodriguez stood watch in the damage control station, studying the MIST system controls with the focused attention of someone whose life might depend on understanding every valve and gauge. He was 19 years old, from a small town in New Mexico, where the closest he had come to the ocean was photographs in National Geographic. Now he was responsible for equipment that could save or doom an entire ship. The training had been intensive but rushed. 2 weeks to learn systems that engineers had spent years developing. Rodriguez and his fellow sailors absorbed what they could, memorized procedures, practiced valve sequences, drilled responses until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. But beneath the training was a persistent anxiety. What if he made a mistake? What if, in the chaos of actual fire, he forgot a step or turned the wrong valve or hesitated at exactly the moment when hesitation meant death? His chief, a veteran of 3 campaigns, had offered uncomfortable wisdom. You'll make mistakes. Everyone does. The question is whether you make them while moving forward or while standing still. The philosophy was not comforting. It was simply true. The Navy had recognized early that the MIST system's effectiveness depended entirely on the humans who operated it. The physics worked in laboratories and controlled tests, but combat introduced variables that no simulation could fully replicate: fear, darkness, injuries, confusion, and the paralyzing pressure of knowing that lives depended on actions taken in seconds. So they adapted training. Instead of teaching the system in isolation, they taught it within the context of chaos. Instructors set fires and then introduced complications: imaginary casualties, simulated equipment failures, conflicting orders. Sailors learned to operate the system while wearing gas masks, in darkness, while injured, while other sailors screamed for help. It was brutal training. It was also necessary. Rodriguez discovered something during these drills. The MIST system was forgiving in ways traditional equipment was not. If he activated it too early, it simply cooled the space preventatively. If he maintained it too long, it used more water but caused no harm. The system accommodated human imperfection better than rigid procedures that demanded flawless execution. That tolerance for error, he realized, was itself an innovation. The engineers had designed not just for ideal operation but for probable failure. They had anticipated that frightened sailors in burning ships would not perform perfectly. So they had created a system that worked even when human operators were less than optimal. In May, Rodriguez's ship took damage during a night engagement, not from enemy fire, from a mechanical failure that ruptured a fuel line and sprayed diesel across hot engine components. The fire ignited instantly, filling the engine room with flames and smoke. Rodriguez responded exactly as trained. He activated the mist system, sealed ventilation, monitored pressure gauges, but his hands were shaking. His breath came in short gasps, and for 5 eternal seconds he could not remember whether he was supposed to open or close the secondary valve. He chose. The valve turned. The system activated properly. Later, his chief would tell him he had done well. Rodriguez would remember only the 5 seconds of paralyzing doubt and wonder. How many men had died in similar moments of uncertainty? But the fire was contained. The ship survived. And Rodriguez had learned something that no training could teach: the difference between knowing procedures and trusting yourself to execute them when everything was chaos and smoke and fear. Across the fleet, thousands of sailors were learning similar lessons. The mist system was proving its effectiveness in combat after combat, but its effectiveness was inseparable from the men who operated it. Their training, their courage, their ability to function when functioning seemed impossible. The Navy began documenting not just technical performance but human factors. Which procedures worked under stress? Which created confusion? How could training better prepare sailors for the psychological reality of fighting fires in combat? They discovered that the best damage control teams were not necessarily those with the most experienced personnel. They were teams that trusted each other, communicated clearly, and had practiced together enough to function without conscious coordination. The MIST system was a tool. But tools were only effective in hands that knew how to use them under conditions that made use nearly impossible. By summer, the integration was showing results. Casualty rates from shipboard fires had dropped measurably. Ships that would have been lost were returning to service, and sailors who would have died fighting flames with inadequate equipment were surviving to fight again. But survival came with its own burdens. Rodriguez watched men return from fire duty with burns and smoke inhalation, and the blank expression of those who had seen things they could not unsee. The mist system had saved them, but it had not protected them from the trauma of standing in burning spaces, feeling heat that could melt steel, knowing that death was waiting in every wrong decision. There was no innovation that could eliminate that fear, no technology that could make fire safe. The mist system had changed the mathematics of survival, yes, but it had not changed the fundamental reality that fighting fire aboard a ship at war required men to confront their own mortality in ways that left scars no medical report documented. Rodriguez stood his watches, maintained his equipment, and tried not to think too much about what would happen the next time alarm bells sounded and someone ordered him into smoke and heat and chaos. He was 19 years old. He would do his job. That was all anyone could ask, and more than anyone should have to give. July 1943. In shipyards across the United States, the sound of riveting hammers mixed with the hiss of welding torches as installation crews worked to retrofit the MIST system into vessels that had been designed before anyone imagined such technology. The work was meticulous, demanding, and never-ending. As soon as one ship was completed, another arrived, and behind it a line of vessels stretching into the harbor, all waiting their turn for upgrades that might mean the difference between survival and loss. The engineering challenge was substantial. Each ship class had different layouts, different compartment configurations, different existing systems to integrate with. A destroyer's tight spaces required different nozzle placement than a carrier's vast hangar decks. Submarines needed specially adapted systems that could function in sealed environments. Amphibious vessels required protection that would not interfere with their unique mission requirements. Patterson and his team became troubleshooters, traveling from yard to yard, solving problems that nobody had anticipated. They discovered that salt deposits clogged nozzles faster than freshwater contamination. They learned that certain steel alloys reacted poorly with the chemical additives in the mist. They found that ventilation systems designed for normal operations could spread fire instead of containing it when mist was deployed incorrectly. Each problem required a solution. Each solution required testing, and testing took time that men in combat did not have. But gradually, methodically, the fleet was transforming. Ships that had been vulnerable were becoming resistant. Compartments that had been death traps were becoming survivable. The innovation was spreading not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through patient, persistent application of engineering to the messy reality of wartime operations. By autumn, the MIST system had been installed on more than 200 vessels. The data from combat operations was overwhelming. Ships equipped with the system were surviving fires at rates dramatically higher than those still relying solely on traditional methods. The average time to control a fire had dropped from hours to minutes. Water damage from firefighting had decreased by orders of magnitude, and most significantly, casualties from shipboard fires had fallen to levels that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. But the system's success created new complications. As more ships were equipped, expectations changed. Commanders began assuming that fire damage would be manageable. Battle plans incorporated assumptions about ship survivability that would have been reckless without the MIST system. The innovation that had begun as a way to prevent catastrophic loss was now being factored into tactical calculations about acceptable risk. Patterson found this development troubling. The MIST system was effective, yes, but it was not invincible. It could fail. It could be overwhelmed. And the attitude that treated it as a guarantee, rather than a tool, was dangerous. Ships were still made of steel and fuel and explosives. Physics still imposed limits on what could be survived. He wrote cautionary notes in his reports. He emphasized in training sessions that the system was a defensive measure, not a license for recklessness. But he also understood that in wartime, any advantage would inevitably be pushed to its limits. Commanders who had watched ships burn would naturally incorporate fire suppression capability into their operational thinking. The war was teaching both sides simultaneously. American ships became harder to sink through fire. Japanese tactics adapted, focusing more on overwhelming damage through multiple simultaneous hits. Kamikaze attacks intensified, deliberately targeting areas where fire damage would be most catastrophic even if the MIST system was functioning. Innovation and counter-innovation in the endless cycle that defined naval warfare. In November, a carrier survived an attack that should have destroyed her. 3 kamikaze strikes in rapid succession, each delivering aviation fuel and explosions into vulnerable spaces. The damage was catastrophic. The fires were immediate and intense. Traditional firefighting alone would have been futile, but the MIST system, combined with aggressive damage control and extraordinary courage from the crew, contained the fires long enough for other measures to be effective. The ship survived. She would require months of repairs, but she survived. The incident became a case study taught in every damage control school, not because it demonstrated the MIST system's perfection, but because it showed what became possible when technology and training and human determination combined. The system had not saved the ship by itself. The sailors had not saved it through courage alone. Technology and humanity, working together, had achieved what neither could accomplish separately. By year's end, the MIST system was standard equipment on every new vessel entering service. Older ships were being retrofitted as fast as shipyard capacity allowed. The innovation that had begun as an experimental response to a desperate problem had become embedded infrastructure, so fundamental that sailors could barely remember when it had not existed. Patterson, reviewing end-of-year reports, felt both satisfaction and unease. The system worked. Lives were being saved. Ships were surviving that would have been lost. By any measure, the innovation was a success, but he could not forget the ships that had burned before the system was ready. The sailors who had died fighting fires with equipment that was inadequate. The gap between knowing what was needed and being able to deliver it in time. Innovation, he had learned, was measured not in breakthroughs, but in the distance between what was possible and what arrived in time to matter. The MIST system had closed that gap, but the gap had never fully disappeared, and men had died in the space between invention and implementation. That was the cost no report documented and no statistic captured. February 1944. Off the coast of the Marshall Islands, a destroyer burned with an intensity that defied every system designed to save her. She had taken a torpedo amidships, not from a submarine but from an experimental Japanese aerial torpedo that had struck below the waterline with devastating accuracy. The explosion had ruptured fuel tanks, compromised watertight integrity, and ignited fires in multiple compartments simultaneously. The crew responded with everything they had. Traditional hoses deployed, MIST systems activated, damage control teams sealed bulkheads, and flooded peripheral spaces. They followed every procedure, executed every protocol, used every innovation the Navy had developed. The ship sank anyway. 73 men died. Not from lack of training or equipment failure or human error. They died because there were limits to what technology could overcome. Some damage was simply too extensive. Some fires burned too hot and spread too fast. And sometimes, despite everything men and machines could do, physics demanded its price. The loss shook confidence in ways that earlier casualties had not. When ships burned because equipment was inadequate or sailors were untrained, there was something to fix, something to improve. But this destroyer had possessed the best firefighting systems available. Her crew had been extensively trained. They had done everything right, and it had not been enough. Commander Halstead, now assigned to damage control training, used the incident in his lectures, not to demoralize students but to ensure they understood reality. The MIST system is the best tool we have, he told classes of young sailors. But tools have limits. Your job is not to prevent every loss. Your job is to save every ship that can be saved, and to know the difference. It was a harder lesson than teaching procedures. It required sailors to accept that sometimes courage and technology would not be sufficient, that sometimes they would do everything right and still watch shipmates die, that the line between heroic save and tragic loss was often determined by factors beyond anyone's control. But Halstead also emphasized the successes. For every ship lost despite the MIST system, 5 others survived because of it. The technology had changed the mathematics of naval warfare dramatically. Ships that would have burned to the waterline were returning to service. Sailors who would have died were going home to families. The system had not eliminated loss, but it had transformed catastrophe into survivability, often enough that the fleet's effectiveness had fundamentally changed. By spring 1944, the Navy had accumulated enough data to understand not just the MIST system's capabilities, but its limitations. They knew which types of fires it handled effectively and which required other approaches. They understood how compartment design affected system performance. They had identified failure modes and developed contingencies. This knowledge was systematically incorporated into training and procedures. Sailors learned not just to operate the system, but to understand its boundaries. They learned to recognize when MIST would be sufficient and when other measures were necessary. They learned to make rapid assessments based on fire behavior, damage patterns, and available resources. The sophistication of damage control had evolved dramatically. What had been simple procedures, aim water at flames, had become complex decision matrices requiring judgment, training, and understanding of multiple integrated systems. Patterson, observing this evolution, recognized something significant. The MIST system had not replaced human expertise. It had elevated it. The technology had not made sailors less important. It had made their knowledge and judgment more crucial than ever. Innovation had not simplified firefighting. It had made effective firefighting possible in situations where simple approaches failed. In June, a cruiser survived an attack that would have been catastrophic 2 years earlier. Multiple fires in engineering spaces, fuel leaks, electrical system damage. The damage control team used the MIST system strategically, deploying it where it would be most effective while using traditional methods in areas where water volume was more important than efficiency. The ship survived, but barely, and the after-action report was honest about how close they had come to loss. The MIST system had been necessary but not sufficient. Traditional methods had been essential, but inadequate alone. Only the combination, applied with judgment born from experience and training, had made survival possible. That report became required reading in damage control schools. It illustrated what Halstead had been teaching, that innovation was not about replacing old methods with new ones, but about expanding the range of responses available when disaster struck. By summer, the conversation had shifted. Officers no longer debated whether the MIST system worked. The evidence was overwhelming. Instead, they discussed how to maximize its effectiveness, how to integrate it more completely with other damage control measures, how to train sailors to make better decisions under impossible conditions. The innovation had moved beyond proof of concept into mature deployment. The MIST system was no longer experimental technology. It was infrastructure, as fundamental to ship design as pumps and generators and the hull itself. But the destroyer that had sunk despite having every advantage stood as permanent reminder. Innovation expanded possibilities, but did not eliminate limits. Technology changed what was survivable, but did not make survival guaranteed. Some fires could be fought, others could only be endured. And knowing the difference remained the most important skill any sailor could possess. August 1945. The war was ending, though its conclusion would come through atomic fire rather than naval combat. but aboard hundreds of ships scattered across 2 oceans, the mist systems that had been installed over 3 years of desperate innovation continued their quiet work, protecting vessels that would sail into peacetime, carrying lessons learned in flame and smoke. Patterson stood on the deck of a carrier anchored in Tokyo Bay, watching the surrender ceremonies from a distance. The ship had survived the war despite taking damage in 4 separate actions. Each time, fires had threatened to destroy her. Each time, the mist system, combined with skilled damage control teams, had contained the flames long enough for other measures to be effective. The system had not been perfect. It had not prevented all losses, but it had transformed naval warfare in ways that would have seemed impossible when Patterson had first sketched his ideas in a darkened laboratory years earlier. The innovation that had begun as desperate experimentation had become proven technology, so thoroughly integrated into fleet operations that younger sailors barely remembered when it had not existed. The statistics told part of the story. Over the course of the war, ships equipped with mist systems had survival rates 23% higher than those relying solely on traditional firefighting methods. The time to control average fires had been reduced by 62%. Casualties from shipboard fires had decreased by 41% after system installation became widespread. But statistics could not capture the fuller reality. They could not measure the psychological confidence that came from knowing effective firefighting tools were available. They could not quantify the strategic flexibility that came from commanders knowing their ships could survive damage that would have been catastrophic earlier in the war. They could not document the individual moments when sailors made split-second decisions that saved ships and lives because they had tools adequate to the threat they faced. Chief Morrison, now preparing for discharge after 4 years of war, thought about the men he had trained and the fires they had fought. Some of his sailors had died despite having the best equipment available. Others had survived encounters with flames that would have killed them without the mist system. The technology had not eliminated danger, but it had shifted odds enough that more men came home than would have otherwise. That was not triumph. It was simply better than the alternative. As the Navy transitioned to peacetime operations, the lessons from wartime innovation were systematically documented. Engineering manuals were revised to include the mist system as standard practice. Training curricula were updated to reflect the integrated approach to damage control that had evolved through hard experience. Ship designs were modified to incorporate firefighting infrastructure from the beginning, rather than retrofitting it afterward. The innovation was becoming invisible, not because it was forgotten, but because it had been absorbed so completely that it was simply part of how things worked. That was the ultimate measure of successful innovation, when it stopped being remarkable and became foundational. Patterson retired from active duty in 1946. He had been offered positions continuing research and development, but he declined. The mist system worked. It had been refined through combat testing and incorporated into standard practice. His contribution was complete, but before leaving naval service, he wrote one final report. Not about technical specifications or performance metrics, but about the process of innovation during wartime. He documented the resistance, the skepticism, the institutional inertia that had delayed implementation. He wrote honestly about the ships that had burned and the men who had died in the gap between knowing what was needed and being able to deliver it. His report was classified and filed away, considered too candid for public distribution, but it was read by officers responsible for future innovation, and they learned from Patterson's honesty that technological advancement was not just about invention, but about the painful work of implementation, of overcoming resistance, revising procedures, training personnel, and accepting that even the best innovations would arrive too late for some. Decades later, when researchers studied the Pacific War's damage control evolution, they would recognize the mist system as one of the war's most significant but least celebrated innovations. It had not won battles the way new aircraft or weapons had, but it had allowed the fleet to sustain battle damage and continue operations in ways that would have been impossible otherwise. The system itself evolved beyond Patterson's original design. Post-war engineers refined nozzle technology, improved pressure regulation, developed more effective chemical additives. The fundamental principle, fighting fire with vaporized water, remained unchanged, but the implementation became increasingly sophisticated, incorporating lessons from thousands of fires fought across years of combat. Subscribe to our channel to uncover more hidden stories of World War II, stories of resilience, memory, and redemption. Thank you for watching. Today, every naval vessel carries descendants of Patterson's innovation, The specific technology has advanced, but the core insight remains that fighting fire effectively requires understanding physics as much as courage. That innovation requires not just invention, but the grinding work of implementation, and that the measure of technology's value is not in laboratory perfection, but in the number of sailors who came home because someone imagined a better way. The mist systems aboard modern warships are monuments to an idea tested in fire and refined through loss. That survival depends on understanding the simple physics of heat and water and vapor, and on the courage to trust innovation when tradition has proven inadequate. Some saved hundreds of ships from fire, but the true numbers saved were the men aboard those ships, sailors who lived because someone had transformed simple physics into complex salvation.